Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to our Constitution Day Convocation. The Constitution begins, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of prosperity to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Sometimes the worthiest goals are those that are hardest to keep in practice. And so there is much debate to be had about the various amendments that the Constitution provides, and that is what we are going to be getting into today. So the First Amendment is the one securing freedom of speech, and it is one hotly debated for a variety of reasons. And so today we have our debate team responding to the question, does the First Amendment allow for public libraries to be able to ban books? And for our pro side supporting book banning, we have Rosalind Tressel and Elizabeth Visser. And our against side, against book banning, we have Stephen McGovern and Fiona Kelly. So we are going to set this up. We are going to have alternating debaters. They all have independent statements. So we're going to have one team present, we're going to have the opposing team present, and then one team present and the opposing team present. So to determine who is going to present first, we have a coin flip. Who is going to be calling it?
Heads.
Heads. All right. It's heads.
You gotta wait until it turns green. It'll take a while, yeah.
There we go. All right. In the First Amendment, the emphasized rights specifically in this argument are the rights to the free exercise of speech and press. The question is, does the First Amendment allow public library book bans? We say yes. The First Amendment does not prevent public libraries from banning books under certain circumstances. Some reasons for this are the presence of obscene literature in public libraries and schools, child pornography, as well as the speech inciting violence. The definition of public library we are using is from the Department of Education and is this: entities established under state laws to serve a community and provide access to a wide range of information, resources, and services. This definition includes public schools, which are entities established under state laws to serve a community and provide access to a wide range of information, resources, and services. The definition of obscenity is material which deals with sex in a manner appealing to prurient interest. Prurient is defined as having or encouraging an excessive or inappropriate interest in sexual matters, especially the sexual activities and intimate affairs of others. This definition is taken from the Oxford Dictionary. So again, visiting the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right to the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. With the definition of public libraries I provided, it said a wide variety, not everything. When we include everything in this, it allows for the child pornography, the obscene literature, all this. And this was a case, Miller versus California in 1974. This case was a bookseller that was selling pornographic materials in public ways. So these would be like brochures that showed up in people's mailboxes. Anyone could have access to these, similar to what a public library allows. In the court case, though, it was ruled that it did not fall under the First Amendment rights because it requires, that court case required people distributing free speech to take responsibility for what they produce. And it declared that obscene literature does not fall under First Amendment rights, which is what this business was doing. Another court case was Roth versus United States in 1957. The defendants argued that obscenity should not be based on the average adult's understanding of it. So what it was saying was that, okay, we shouldn't define obscenity based on children, but on adults. This turned that down and said books should be on a case-by-case basis. And our current understanding of obscenity is indeed based on what children can and can't read, and what is or isn't appropriate to them. Because in public libraries, these materials are also available to children. And adding on to this, the place where children are, namely public schools, also their libraries also qualify as public libraries. And recently, in the past couple of years, there have been many cases where students have found inappropriate, illicit books in their public school libraries, which are available to the public. Anyone can read them, including the children. And they contained obscene imagery. You can just look this up on YouTube, but I have a couple of examples. There was one, 11-year-old silences school board as he reads a disturbing book found in a school library. This book detailed genitalia and inappropriate remarks based off of LGBTQ and other issues, but specifically regarding the very physical and body and sexual images which children should not be exposed to. And there are many other YouTube videos like this. And while these parents are reading these passages to these school boards are shutting them down, saying, okay, this isn't appropriate for this room, why are we reading it? Well, if it's inappropriate for the room full of adults, why is it appropriate in a room full of children? And that is all I have to say at the moment. It does indeed take a while. Here, do you want to take this one?
What was your name again?
Ross.
Ross, thank you. Thank you, Ross. Yes. So I'm not a deep student of the law. I love my country, but I'm going to take a little bit more of a tact that similar to what the great orator William Jennings Bryan did about 100 years ago, trying to argue against having evolution taught in public schools. He didn't really argue so much against it per se as what effect it would have on society. So I'm just going to take what I see as more of just a commonsensical view of why I think book bans are likely to cause more harm than good, and how we can still achieve many of the goods without the federal government getting involved in bans. First of all, I want to note that wrapped up in the First Amendment, we also have the freedom of religion. Obviously, all of us here hold some sort of deep religious belief, and we realize that there are others who disagree, but we recognize the fundamental right of each other to disagree with each other, and that you can't force belief. And to a certain degree, you can't force what other people choose to read or not to read. And in fact, the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to America, he was surprised by how freedom of religion had created such a robust religion among the true believers of Christianity and how vital it was. He also said, and I quote, "To get the inestimable good that freedom of the press assures, one must know how to submit to the inevitable evil it gives rise to." And he had been in a country where freedom had gone off the rails, and he still thought it was an inestimable good. Now, realizing too, though, that as Franklin D. Roosevelt says, freedom of the press is essential to the preservation of democracy, but there's a difference between freedom and license. But again, I don't think that we should have the federal government get involved with book bans. I would agree with Roz that the descriptions of the books she was describing were indeed egregious and should not be read in public schools. But I believe that censorship can and should still be done, but I think it should be done on the level of the family. So if parents don't trust their public libraries to a certain extent, they can, if their children are minors, I think they definitely have the right to ask their children not to go to the libraries, and the parents can still go themselves and pick out selections that they believe can benefit their children's education. So they can even still make use of the public libraries, but that they don't have to let their children be exposed to anything. In another case, too, thinking about what happened when we tried to ban prohibition, it didn't make alcohol go away. It just made alcohol this hot black market commodity that was suddenly even more interesting and rebellious to, find ways to indulge in by the very fact that it was banned. So by trying to ban these books, we might, in fact, just incite those who find thrills in doing what the government thinks they're not supposed to. It would add a new level of, excitement to it for those who want to be rebellious against the federal government. And again, even if we were to create some sort of litmus test for banning books, if it's on the level of the federal government, how are we to ensure that the federal government can't just bend it however it wants based on the officials who are in power to somehow ban the books that they want banned, but yet not others? I am a theology major, and I'm just going to read you a passage that I read from Genesis this past week for my studies. This is Genesis 19, chapter 30, or Genesis 19, verse 30. Now Lot went out of Zoar and dwelt in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. So he dwelt in the cave with his 2 daughters. And the first said to the younger, Our father is old, and there's not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. And on the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine again also, that you may go and lie with him, and we may preserve offspring. Again, later there's talks about how Onan spilt his semen on the ground. The book of Judges talks about the woman who was raped and then cut into 12 pieces. Now, clearly, as I'm going to assume the majority of us in here are Christians and hold the Bible to be one of the greatest books in the history, the greatest collection of books in the history of the world. But it's easy to see how a government official who was bent on somehow trying to outlaw the Bible in libraries could somehow find a way. I believe that he could find a way to stretch the law so as to somehow refer to the Bible. So that is a danger, that we are under the interpretation of whoever happens to be in office at the moment instead of more local communities. And lastly, literature is meant to be a means of working to identify with others, not necessarily just the books that we solely find to be in our own beliefs. And there are libraries out there, especially in private schools and private universities, such as even on this campus, where we can have the books that we want and promote the books that we want. But ultimately, it's not always. There are many books out there that we may disagree with that can still have value to dialogue and value to human society. Even if there are not necessarily pornographic, but still the stories of people and relationships of lesbian, gay, transgender. Clearly, this is part of the human experience, and it all goes back. Even in Genesis, we see since the beginning of time there have been these difficulties in the human struggle, and this is part of the human story and of human difficulty and frustration. And especially in our day of media tidbits and arguing, I personally believe it's much more likely to lead to fruitful dialogue if we actually read the stories of these people and try to come to understanding. And Pope John Paul II himself brought Marxist literature into the papal conclave before he was elected pope, because he studied the ideas of these people, and ultimately he had a marvelous, tremendous effect on the destruction of communism in his home country, because he understood Marxism and how it appealed to people and how he could more fully satisfy what they truly desired. And even Aristotle, in the Metaphysics, he says that we should be grateful, and I quote, "We should be grateful not only to those with whose views we may agree, but also to those who've expressed more superficial views." Even he believed that even they have the possibility to contribute somehow to society and the search for wisdom. I hope that some of these points will demonstrate why federal book bans are unwise and why ultimately book bans cannot happen under the First Amendment. That's all I have. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. While the First Amendment protects the freedom of expression, it does not guarantee unrestricted access to all materials in public libraries. Constitutional clauses establish laws, and Supreme Court precedent affirms that governments may regulate library collections, especially concerning obscenity, age-appropriate, and community welfare. Similar with other First Amendment freedoms, we have religion, assembly, press, petition, and speech. But we can notice that assembly isn't all assembly. Religion isn't all religions, and that petitions aren't all petitions. You can't have an assembly of people that are violent. You can't have a violent assembly of people. So we can already see that just because the First Amendment allows for it doesn't mean that it allows for all types of it. So with that, I do believe that it allows for the banning of books, and I'll get into that. So the Necessary and Proper Clause, as Roz beautifully initiated, it allows to pass laws that are necessary and proper that we deem as a community are necessary and proper. In the preamble, it states to promote general welfare. And realistically, I believe that banning books can allow to promote better general welfare. Regulating publicly funding institutions like libraries is a legitimate exercise of this power. Banning and restricting certain books may be necessary and proper to maintain order, protect minors, and align with community standards. Excuse me, I've been having allergies all week. Okay, so the First Amendment interpretation, it guarantees freedom of speech press, like I have stated, but we also have First Amendment court cases that we can look at. Same with Miller in California, like she mentioned, and then New York versus Ferber, which specifically goes into child pornography, where the state kind of ultimately decided upon that the state's interest in preventing child sexual exploitation of minors was a compelling enough government objective to surpass importance. Similarly to that, there was also Ohio versus Brandenburg, which speech incited violence or lawlessness of actions. The court used two-pronged tests to evaluate speech acts. The first being speech can be prohibited if it is directed at or inciting or producing imminent lawless action. And the second is likely to incite or produce such actions. So with that, those are all from OYA's, all of those quotes. Thus, libraries are not compelled to provide materials failing to unprotected categories. The 10th Amendment is also the amendment of state powers. Powers not delegated to the federal government are restricted to or reserved to the states of the people. States have broad authority over education and public institutions, including libraries. Communities can decide materials that are appropriate for taxpayer-funded collections, meaning that your libraries can look at what you want your libraries to look like. It can share the morals that you want your community to be seen in, and it honestly happens at a very local level. Second, we're going to be looking at more obscenity laws, which are the Miller test, as we talked about. A Miller test, a work can be banned if it appeals to prudent interest, is patiently offensive, and lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific values. The standard allows for libraries to lawfully accept obscene or sexually explicit content. Schools or library cases, so these are some court cases I had also looked at. So Board of Education versus PICO, I believe, in 1982, courts held that school boards can't remove books just because they dislike the idea of the book, but that they may remove books that are vulgar, inappropriate, or educationally unsuitable. Another court case to look at is, I believe I'm saying this right, Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer in 1988. Schools can regulate speech that is inconsistent with educational mission and that can extend the library's connections. All right, another issue that we run into here is that public library rights and responsibilities. Public libraries are limited forms. Courts have restrictions on content and allow them to be viewpoint neutral to legitimate government interest. Examples: protecting minors, space limitation, and budget constraints. The libraries aren't being given thousands upon thousands of dollars to buy every single book that comes out each day. There are so many books that get released each day that we cannot keep up as a library. You simply will not see all of the books in the library. So libraries already banned or exclude materials at time, budget priorities, catalog curation, or age restrictions. We already see those. Give me 1 second, sorry. Okay. I also see practical justifications for book banning, such as protecting minors, government's compelling interest in shielding children from harmful content, age-appropriate filtering as a wide acceptance in school and variety, community standards, as I had brought up before. Taxpayer-funded institutions should reflect the community values while still offering diverse viewpoints. Allowing unrestricted access undermines parental rights and community values, and resource and space constraints. Libraries cannot physically or financially carry every book you want. Exclusions, decisions are inevitable. Banning is often a resource of prioritization. We also have the freedom of expression ourselves. If we want books, we can buy them. It's an amazing thing. But with that, I'll hold the rest of it until my counter arguments, but thank you guys.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Before I get into the bulk of this argument, I want to step back and take a closer look again at the actual text of the question. If you've somehow forgotten it, I'll restate it for you now. Does the First Amendment allow for public library book bans? I think it's become necessary to emphasize what this question is not. It's not a question of the morality of book bans. It's not a question of whether the aims of book banning can be otherwise accomplished. It's not a question of whether book bannings or no book bannings will lead to the downfall of society as we know it. It's a question, ultimately, of whether the First Amendment allows for books to be banned from public libraries. And the answer, basically, I really do think is no. To illustrate that answer, I'm going to make what may initially seem to be a bit of a narrow distinction. So bear with me, please. Content-based regulation of speech is non-constitutional. Clearly and admittedly, however, as my opponents have described, there are forms of speech that are not protected by the First Amendment. A mostly complete list of these include child pornography, libel, obscenity, and any incitements to crime. Each of these, though, is illegal in a way that's external to the scope of the First Amendment. The content of child pornography is morally reprehensible, obviously, but that's not why it's illegal. It's illegal because it involves statutory rape in its production and often inspires the same in its consumption. In this way, it is both a crime and an incitement to a crime. Its illegality is external to its content. To take perhaps an extreme example, just as murder is illegal for reasons outside the First Amendment, so too these seeming exceptions are illegal for reasons outside the First Amendment. To say that the First Amendment allows for these things to be illegal is then nearly as ludicrous as saying that the First Amendment allows for murder to be illegal. These modes of expression are out of its scope. Obscenity is the mode of expression whose regulation is the closest to being within the scope of the First Amendment. At this point, the Supreme Court uses the Miller test to determine whether or not a work can be considered to be obscene. I know we've heard an overview of the Miller test. I will give it again with very specific wording. There are 3 conditions, and they are as follows. It has to be determined, number 1, whether the work lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Number 2, whether the work depicts or describes sexual or excretory acts in a clearly offensive way. And number 3, whether the average community member would find that the work was appealing to prurient interests. All 3 of these have to be satisfied in order for the work to be considered obscene. The first condition is about merit, which is separate from content value. Content that is morally good does not make a work meritorious, and content that is morally evil does not make a work lack merit. The second condition is closest to content regulation, but it does not involve the First Amendment because this is subject to state law and state definitions of what is clearly offensive sexual and excretory acts. That is a case of state law being an exception to the Bill of Rights. The third condition is not based on content, but on author and consumer intent. Because, too, all 3 of these conditions have to be met in order for a work to be judged obscene, the test on a whole cannot be said to be content-based regulation. Also, since it has been demonstrated multiple times in court that getting anything actually defined as obscene under the Miller test is practically impossible due to its subjectivity, it effectively does not allow for banning under the charge of obscenity. Beyond any of these broad questions of exceptions, there is clear legal precedent for this question that applies to public libraries. First, I do think it's necessary to differentiate between public libraries and school libraries. You can make the claim, absolutely, that school libraries have a certain moral imperative to protect children from certain topics. You would, however, be hard-pressed to universally properly define the range and scope of these topics. It's often better to let parents actually parent their children. The United States is a melting pot. It has a wide variety of cultural and religious differences. We cannot impose our particular moral subset for our children onto the children of everyone else. The issue of public libraries does not have this compounding factor. It is a public institution for all ages with books divided by age group and by topic. Any demands for public institutions to be censored according only to personal morals falls apart extremely quickly. I would also like to make a distinction between book banning and books being excluded from public libraries due to costs. One of those is proactive, the other one is inactive. In one of those cases, books are deliberately not being allowed in libraries. In the other case, libraries simply don't have the resources to purchase them. The two cannot be equated. This is also not a question about books being generally banned, their publishing, their distribution, their consumption, their possession. This is a question specifically about governmental control over the artistic content of publicly funded agencies. In the early 2000s, there was massive controversy surrounding the National Endowment for the Arts, hereafter abbreviated as NEA, which is a publicly funded arts program that sponsors artists to create art and then displays that art in galleries. There were various pieces created during the early 2000s and also during the 1980s They were displayed in these galleries that contained religious imagery, homosexual imagery, excretory imagery, and there was public outrage as a result. The government cut funding to the NEA sued, and eventually it made its way to the Supreme Court, which stated that although the government does not have a responsibility to sponsor art, once it does decide to provide funds for arts programs, the government cannot withdraw that funding, thereby censoring certain works because it disagrees with the viewpoint expressed in the works. In other words, while the government has great flexibility in determining which artists and which programs to fund, it must do so in a manner consistent with the First Amendment and cannot do so in a vague or viewpoint-based way. As stated by the National Coalition Against Censorship, public funding for the arts does not allow the government to play the role of censor. Public libraries can be thought of as analogous to these arts programs because they too involve the, albeit somewhat indirect, sponsorship of artists and directly the promotion and distribution of art. In this way, there is legal precedent. Public libraries have already been funded, so the government, having established that financial sponsorship, cannot now regulate the content these libraries promote in a viewpoint-based way. I want to make the point too, as I close off here, that Stephen has already made, but I'll reiterate, that book bannings in general are a slippery slope. Attempts to broaden the definition of obscenity or to ban books from public libraries on any grounds that do not involve external illegalities cannot be accomplished without also collecting in the net works that clearly should not be banned. Any attempts to ban depictions or descriptions of sex in books results in the banning of books like Ulysses by James Joyce that have enormous artistic merit, whose sex scenes are necessary and not gratuitous. Banning depictions or descriptions of nudity in books results in the banning of medical textbooks as well as the Bible. Banning depictions or descriptions of violence in books results in the banning of murder mysteries, war novels, as well as the Iliad and the Odyssey. And a hot button issue that's been brought up by my opponents, and an issue that is kind of the base of most of the attempts to ban books at the state level, banning depictions or descriptions of LGBTQ topics results in the banning of literary classics like The Picture of Dorian Gray and Mrs. Dalloway, both of which, by the way, I have been very correctly assigned to read at this university. A moral disagreement with content does not constitute a lack of merit. The First Amendment cannot be said to allow for public library book bans because any regulation of content that is not externally illegal is non-constitutional. Thank you.
I do.
That was my final statement, but we can have a final statement.
All right, so we're going to do a final statement. Wrap this up. I wanted to address some of the points they made before passing off the final statement to Elizabeth. They brought up several good points, but I did want to emphasize that the public library book bans in which we are talking about are state and local and not federal. Federal is on a very different level and often not involved with book bans. It is often state, local, again. Again, the question asked about public libraries, not individual people or illegality. Obviously, pornography is still available for individual purpose, and the intent for the books I mentioned is to inform children of these sexual ideas. These LGBTQ books are true, like they can be very beautiful to read and are important pieces of literature. But when they're put in front of children in order to be consumed by them, and the intent is to inform children of these sexual ideas and bring their minds to those ideas, that can be very unhealthy, very dangerous. And one example that's often pointed to is the book 1984. And oftentimes in public schools, it's not banned because of ideals. It has in the past, but not all the time, but because of the explicit imagery in them. And it shouldn't necessarily be given to school children. I myself have read 1984. It It is a good book. It is a literary classic, but it is also not necessarily appropriate to be read by elementary-aged children.
Yeah, so I really love what Steven said about how it should be on a familial level, and I agree, it really should be. But we also have to have the issue of people, an average adult only reads one book a month. That's really problematic. And so with all of the content coming out at us, it's really hard to say on a personal level, oh, my kid can't read that, my kid can read this, because I haven't read it, and if you haven't read it, I think it's kind of nice to at least have that idea of, okay, maybe the government says this isn't great for my kid, and I can still make that decision to go buy that book, have my kid read the book myself, but to allow for it on a more on a more local and state level kind of just allows me as a person to say, yeah, I can send my kids to the library and I can trust that they will still be able to read something that is age appropriate, but also allows them to adapt their education, learn more. Like, reading is a really good thing for everyone. So I really find it to be beneficial to, yes, have familial control over your family and what content they're containing and they're consuming, but we have to understand that that's not possible with today's age and date. With all of the content we have accessible to us, it's never going to be possible. So I'm okay with allowing the government to have a little bit of say on what should and shouldn't be consumed by the children. Thank you, guys.
I'd like to reiterate quickly that public library book bans are not equivalent to school library book bans, and that books being banned from public libraries, that can't really be done on an argument of protecting the children. I'd also make the argument that when you talk about banning books at the local level as if it's something where you in this utopian community are with other people who have the same ideas and values as you, and you can create this utopian library where every book is something that agrees with you, first of all, that's not very good for your personal development, but also because America is a cultural hegemony, you cannot at all guarantee that the people in your community are going to have the same values as you. And so there are many communities in the Deep South that are very Protestant and extremely anti-Catholic. And if I were to raise a family and move into one of those communities that allowed public library book bans on the local level, and the local community decided that Catholic works were against their community values and couldn't be in the public libraries, that doesn't seem particularly constitutional.
Yes, thank you. Again, I think ultimately it comes down to either way, we're open to the potential for great evils. Either we allow book bans to go farther and potentially farther and farther, and end up banning in a situation where we ban books like the Bible from public libraries. On the other hand, if we have no bans, then we end up with children reading pornographic literature. Obviously, neither of these things are ideal. And obviously, America has been one of the first countries to take that step toward greater freedom with the possibility of greater abuse of that freedom. Again, and I guess I just want to go back to the point of that, maybe I'm confused, but I'm not saying that every parent has to read every piece of literature. I'm just saying that parents of children, at least until when they're minors, can go to the library and take advantage of the good books that are there and bring them back home to their children to read, which is the great thing about libraries, is that you can take books for free for a time. Ultimately, I think that either way, that I think that people who are intent or unconcerned about the real dangers of of truly indecent literature are going to find a way, and ultimately that what we read as Americans is not going to be good unless we ourselves are good. Because with no, if men did not need government, if men did not need government, we would be angels, but we're not. But I think that what America has done in general, and the direction that the world, for better or for worse, from my point of view and from Alexis de Tocqueville's point of view, seems to be toward democracy and greater individual freedom, that it's better not to have this imposed external law, but to learn on a personal and a local level to develop within ourselves the new law of the heart that Christ calls us to in the greatest book of all time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to our Constitution Day debate. Thank you to our wonderful debaters. Remember that America is this beautiful country, not built on sovereignty or race, but on ideals. And ideals are only as worthy as they are in practice when we make ourselves worthy. So thank you for coming again, and have a great day.